So in this video, I'm going to talk about this 1971 Series 2A that we just completed a full restoration on and is offered for sale on our website. So this is NAO number 064. So in this video, I'm going to go over every aspect of this Land Rover, from the mechanical side of things, to the body, to the history, to the driving and ownership experience. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is what makes this 1971 worth restoring. How do you justify all the time and effort that we put into this vehicle over, say, any other series Land Rover out there? So first of all, the year 1971 is notable, and that's because this is the last year of the Series 2A. So that means that the all-metal dash that the Series 2A is known for, the iconic all-metal dash, went away in the following year, 1972, with the introduction of the Series 3. And part of the reason that this is significant is mostly collector value. The last year of any model vehicle is always considered to be the most collectible. So if you think of this in terms of collector cars, one of the most collectible cars is the Chevy Corvette. The 1967 is worth a significant amount more than the 1968 because it's the last year of that very desirable body style. So the same thing applies to the 71. This is the last year before the Series 3. So another important point is that this is an original NADA vehicle. That means that it was imported new to the US. And this particular vehicle happened to go to a Leyland dealer in New Jersey. There just weren't as many Land Rovers imported to the US compared to other markets. We already had the CJ, the Bronco, the International Harvester Scout. We had plenty of 4x4s to choose from. So really, these vehicles were purchased by an individual that had a specific need for what was at the time a premium four-wheel drive. So one example of an NADA only feature are the lights. So you'll notice that this Land Rover has these larger 5-inch turn signals. They're still made by Lucas. You can see Lucas, made in England, but they're mounted lower in the fender than the rest of world lights. The rest of world turn signal would have been mounted kind of up here. And you can see that these are original NADA fenders. If you look at the back, you'll see where the light was supposed to be mounted, and it's completely blanked off. There's no holes drilled there. And there isn't even a hole welded up or, filled in. These are original NADA fenders. So continuing around, you can see it has these side marker lights, amber in the front and red in the back. So in our restoration, any of the lenses that were sun cracked were replaced. The lamp bodies were restored. All of this was brought back to original condition. I mean, this is probably $1,000 just in the lenses for these NADA lights, but the alternative would be to put rest of world lights on this vehicle, which would result in a totally googly-eyed look, because now your turn signals would be mounted really low and off-center. And it might come as a surprise, but the NADA vehicles are actually sought out even outside of the US. We had a customer from Dubai who specifically wanted an NADA Land Rover, and he could easily have, a rest of world spec Land Rover that could be sourced from anywhere in the world. They made hundreds and hundreds of thousands of them, but he specifically sought out an NADA vehicle just so he could have probably the only NADA Land Rover in all of the UAE. And really the last thing I want to touch on as far as originality is that this vehicle is painted in its original color, pastel green. So this is the color that the vehicle left the factory with. So with a few minor exceptions like the 16-inch wheels, it's really how this vehicle would have appeared when it rolled off the assembly line in 1971. So obviously we went to great lengths to keep this vehicle as aesthetically original as possible. And by that same thinking, you might assume that we also kept the drivetrain, the suspension, and the brakes as original as possible as well. But that's not the case here. This vehicle has been heavily updated. So when you think of the slowest and most tractor-like vehicles ever made, you probably think of the series Land Rover. Essentially, it's 70 horsepower and has a design dating back to roughly 1948. So now I'm going to go over some of these upgrades that make this vehicle a little bit more safe to drive on modern roads. So for us, we do not want to throw away the original engines in these. We want to simply rebuild them and update them so that they're safer and more reliable to drive on modern roads. We do not want to put in a 400 horsepower Chevy engine in something with an 88-inch wheelbase, and we don't want to swap in a smoky Mercedes diesel or really any engine other than the original Land Rover gas engine. So the first step in this process is completely disassembling the original 4-cylinder engine and taking it to the machine shop to have the block magnafluxed and checked for cracks. If the block checks out okay, then we're going to have it decked, we're going to have the main tunnel line honed, we're going to have it bored out, in this case 30 over, we're going to have the crank cut undersized, in this case 10 under, rods and mains. We're going to get that short block back to 100%. We're going to use a high quality rear main seal and high quality gasket maker throughout. We're going to use a new casting for the head. The heads are just way too prone to cracking. It's going to be an 8-to-1 compression head. We're going to install hardened valve seats. So by going with these hardened valve seats, it allows you to put unleaded gas in the Land Rover. We're going to install Manley valve seals, which are a lot better than the Land Rover ones. Basically, we're going to create a long block that is as robust as possible. We're going to use a 2.5 liter cam that was available in the later Defender version of this engine. And as far as the tappet assemblies, we're going to check those over for wear, and we're only going to use really good original ones or genuine Land Rover. For the fuel system, we're going to use electronic fuel injection. So this is actually a unit that will bolt right up to the intake manifold without any modification to the intake manifold or the throttle linkage. So this will solve the issues of fuel percolation and vapor lock. So with the original carburetor, if you try to run 10% ethanol gasoline, you're going to have all sorts of running problems in hot weather. So the electronic fuel injection does completely away with that. The computer makes all the decisions as far as the air-fuel ratio. There isn't even a choke to pull. It just works really well. And there's even a handheld screen that you can use to tune the EFI. And in today's world, it's actually easier to find someone who's more familiar with electronic fuel injection than someone who knows how to properly set up a carburetor. So for spark, we're using an electronic ignition with an optimized advance curve that suits the 2.5 liter cam, 8-to-1 compression, and fuel injection. And then for cooling, we're going with a larger aluminum radiator. And we tried a lot of the original radiators and having them record, but we always found that the tanks were always full of cracks. So going with this bigger aluminum radiator just solves all these problems. And even in climates that are hotter than Connecticut, which obviously there are quite a few, you don't need to add a secondary cooling fan that kicks on at a certain temperature. The larger capacity aluminum radiator is just a good, simple solution. So it seems like there are lots and lots of modern parts that are way better than the original Land Rover parts, but that's not entirely true. The exception is pretty much anything made of rubber. The new old stock parts are much better. So any of the rubber parts like the air cleaner hose or the fuel fill hose or the motor mounts, all those new parts are made in India or China. And the rubber is just really poor quality. That even goes for like the shift boots in the interior. We want to use all new old stock. So things like the air cleaner hose, it's so much more flexible and it doesn't dry rot as quickly as aftermarket parts do. So for anything rubber, we're sticking with new old stock. So at this point, we've assembled what we would say is the nicest setup for a Land Rover 4-cylinder gas engine. But what we put behind that engine also matters. So a Series 3 transmission is an excellent solution in a Series 2A. It gives you full synchro mesh on all 4 gears, so you don't need a double clutch. But it also requires the installation of an overdrive if you want to go over, say, 50 miles an hour. And that simply adds more mechanical complexity to the drivetrain. And every time you want to go over 50 miles an hour, you need to reach over to the passenger side of the transmission tunnel, push that overdrive lever forward, and then when you need to come back down below that speed, you need to reach over to the passenger side of the transmission tunnel and pull that lever back. So it's not exactly the most convenient shifting. And shifting a Series 3 transmission still has more of an agricultural feel to it. It's certainly not the most refined transmission ever. So what we've done on this vehicle is go one step beyond the Series 3 transmission with overdrive and just install a later Defender R380 5-speed transmission. These were used all the way up to about 2006. Now you could really make the most of that low horsepower gas engine because you could just row through the gears in these 5 speeds. They shift so much smoother than the early Land Rover transmissions, and you don't need to reach over to the passenger side of the trans tunnel in order to shift the overdrive lever forward. You simply just throw it into 5th gear. So I would say the one modification that we can make to a Series Land Rover that makes the biggest improvement to the way it drives is installing a 5-speed transmission. So you could see I was doing a test drive earlier today. So I'm just blasting down the highway in the passing lane in this truck, and you could see I shift into 5th, and I just peg out the speedometer. It goes up to 70 miles an hour, and I got the needle just touching the choke warning light. it's completely pegged out 75, 80 miles an hour. But you can see this is a flat road. If I was to come to a hill, I would still need to get in the right lane and downshift. But I would say these speeds are really pushing the safety limit for any vehicle with straight axles and an 88-inch wheelbase. It simply won't handle if you need to swerve or maneuver quickly. So really what I call the cruising speed of these Land Rovers is 60 miles an hour. But of course, during the test drive of the vehicle, I need to test the higher speeds to make sure that everything is functioning properly. So seeing a speedometer needle actually go past the numbers on the dial, the first thing you'd probably ask is that speedometer accurate? Well, it is, because there's one old timer in New York State who is a pro at rebuilding series Land Rover speedometers, and this speedometer has been calibrated for 750/16 tires, and the original speedometer would have been calibrated for smaller 15-inch tires. So we do have the speedometer rebuilt, recalibrated, and returned to zero in all of our restorations. So the other thing that you would ask is, what would you possibly do if you actually have to stop from those speeds? So it is true that series Land Rovers probably had the worst brakes that were ever put on a road-going vehicle, but this one has actually been upgraded to four-wheel discs. So now we have the same disc brakes that Defenders came with all the way up to 2016. So these modern Defenders have vented rotors, 4 piston calipers up front, 2 piston calipers in the back, and that whole system is applied to the series Land Rover, which is actually much lighter than a Defender. So needless to say, this Land Rover will stop on the dime. And then what about the rest of the drivetrain? How has that been modified? So another parameter that we feel like we need to stick to on these vehicles is leaf springs. If we change to coil springs like a Defender had, it would change the character of the vehicle substantially, because now we would have to install wider axles and the wheels would stick out much farther in relation to the fenders, which just really wouldn't look right on a series Land Rover. We're sticking with leaf springs, but we are using parabolic springs. So this is a design where the leaves touch together minimally, unlike a multi-leaf spring where you have a thick pack of leaves. And these do ride a lot better. By going with these softer parabolic springs, it actually necessitates using a better gas shock all the way around. So we go with these Old Man Emu twin tube shocks. It's still not as good as a coil sprung vehicle, but it's also not so soft where you would need to add sway bars and stuff like that, because if you make the suspension too soft, now you have massive body lean, and if you do need to pull an evasive maneuver on the highway doing those higher speeds, the vehicle would be more likely to roll. So it's still fairly stiff, but not as stiff as the original springs, which yielded more of a work truck type payload where you're going to be putting firewood or bags of concrete in the back. You could still load our vehicles up with bags of cement, but maybe just not to the extent that the original vehicles could have been loaded. So in our restorations, we want to keep the original manual steering. We don't want to add power steering, but we want to rebuild that steering just right so the vehicle will steer as easily as possible. Part of that is the narrow tires, these 7.5-inch tires. So with these vehicles, you can see when I'm driving it, I'm steering with one hand and I'm palming the wheel just like I would with a power steering vehicle, because the steering is set up just right. So the other thing to note is that when I'm test driving these vehicles, I'm checking the steering feel, and I feel perfectly comfortable taking my hands off the wheel at 75 miles an hour on the highway and not feeling the least bit like the vehicle will wander or dart or do anything strange. So you can see I'm just bombing down Super 7 in the passing lane. I can take my hands off the wheel and this vehicle tracks perfectly straight. And any small corrections I need to make can be done with just a nudge of the steering wheel. So this excellent steering feel comes from a lot of different factors. So first and foremost, it's the preload on the swivels. Too little preload and you hit a bump or even an expansion joint on a bridge, this steering wheel will kick back in your hands pretty hard. Too much preload, you go to pull out of your driveway and that vehicle will just want to keep looping around right into the curb. It won't recenter. So the other thing is the steering relay needs to either be rebuilt or replaced. And of course, in our restorations, we replace all 6 tie rod ends. The best quality tie rod ends are made by Lemforder, the steering relay, the preload on the swivels, and of course, a really high quality rebuild on the steering box all contributes to a vehicle that steers effortlessly. So there's one more aspect of the drivetrain that I want to touch on, and that's noise and vibration. So the R380 5-speed transmission is basically silent. There's almost no gear whine from it. The series transfer case, on the other hand, does have some gear whine. But any transfer case with really strong gears is going to have some gear whine, and the series is no exception. So we can't do away with this gear whine from the transfer case, but we can sound deaden the seat box, the transmission tunnel, and the front of the bulkhead. So we use Dynamat under the entire seat box, anywhere that it's not seen. So the Dynamat is a sound dampener that takes out that tinny sound from the aluminum sheet metal. Then over the Dynamat, we apply Dynaliner, which is a sound deadener. So this actually helps with drivetrain heat and noise. And of course, one thing we would never want to do is add any sort of insulation over the beautiful metal transmission tunnel and bulkhead and seat box in these series Land Rovers. So all of this is installed underneath where it's hidden. So one thing about these series Land Rovers that people are often surprised by is the fact that they do not have body mounts. The body is simply bolted metal to metal right to the frame. So even the early Willys CJ2A had some rudimentary rubber body mounts, and pretty much every car made since that time has had some sort of big rubber body mount to isolate the frame from the body to cut down on vibration, but not on the series. So that's why it's super important to use genuine Land Rover motor and transmission mounts so that that drivetrain vibration isn't translated to the body. You're still going to get some vibration, but not as bad as using cheap made in India or Chinese rubber, where you can see on some of these poor restorations the entire body vibrating because the rubber is so hard. So another thing that contributes to vibration is the drive shafts. So first of all, these vehicles were originally designed to have the front drive shaft rotating all the time, kind of like a Jeep Wrangler TJ, but that's just added drag and wear and tear because there's no need to have the differential, the front half shafts, and the drive shaft rotating when you're not in four-wheel drive. So the solution to that was adding locking hubs. So you can see these hubs are turned to the 4x2 position. So when you're driving on paved roads, you can simply turn them to the two-wheel drive position and your differential half shafts and drive shaft will not be turning. Your hubs will be freewheeling. The rear drive shaft is super short on these, and when you put these parabolic springs on where you have this little bit higher ride height, it does create a vibration. And then with the 5-speed transmission, you actually add 4 inches of length to the drivetrain, so now you have a super short drive shaft. The only solution here is a double cardan drive shaft, and we use a unit made by Tom Woods out in Utah, which is really one of the best builders of drive shafts out there. Pretty much any serious off-road Land Rover is going to have a Tom Woods drive shaft under it. So the last thing that pertains to vibration on these Land Rovers are the wheels. So by going with disc brakes, we need to use 16-inch wheels. This Land Rover originally came with 15-inch wheels. Those 15-inch wheels were actually welded and they were tubeless. But there was no welded tubeless 16-inch wheel available up until like the early 2000s. So all of the 16-inch wheels were riveted and required tubes. So personally, I don't feel safe going highway speeds on a 50-plus-year-old wheel with rivets holding it together. And the 15-inch wheels won't fit over the disc brakes, and there really aren't many choices for tall, skinny 15-inch tires. So the only option are these late Defender tubeless wheels. So you can see this ridge right here helps keep the bead on. So even if the tire got massively punctured and went flat, it's not going to de-bead from the wheel. Plus these wheels are much easier to balance. You can see we have our wheel weight there. On the early type wheels, we would have half the wheel covered in wheel weights just to get them to balance. So late model Defender tubeless wheels, welded construction, not riveted, 16-inch to clear the disc brakes, 5.5-inch wide to allow for these narrow 7.5-inch tires. These are radial tires. These are a modern military design. The whole package is fantastic. We have a drivetrain that has minimal vibration, can do highway speeds without rattling your fillings loose, and is actually pleasurable to drive. So I talked about some of the things that we absolutely have to keep original, like the NAD lights, and I talked about some of the things that we absolutely have to change, like the fuel system, suspension, and brakes. Now I'm going to talk about some of the improvements that we make to the body. So one of the things that make these Land Rovers unique is that the body panels are all aluminum. So the bulkhead here is steel, the door skins are aluminum, the quarter panels are aluminum, the tailgate's aluminum, and then each panel has a steel frame riveted to it to make that aluminum panel rigid. So the problem is anywhere where steel and aluminum touch, there's the possibility of electrolytic corrosion. So the two dissimilar metals react and create corrosion. And this takes the form of a white chalky oxidation on the aluminum and rust and rot on the steel. So that's one of the reasons why we always use these new genuine Land Rover doors on our builds, is because the original door skins have already perforated at the bottom, have tiny little pinholes, and if we repaint that door in about 3 or 4 years, it will start to bubble through on the bottom. Other body panels, like the fenders, where there's really no steel touching them, are usually in perfect condition. So how do we stop this electrolytic corrosion? So first of all, we galvanize every single steel part under the body. So any point where a steel part touches the aluminum, we want to galvanize that part, and we want to paint the aluminum panel on both sides. Land Rover only painted the exterior of the panels from the factory. The inside was left bare aluminum, and the steel only had a thin coat of black paint on it that quickly failed, and then electrolytic corrosion took over. So beyond just stopping electrolytic corrosion on the body panels, we also want to make sure that the frame is fully rust-proofed. To do that, we use a new galvanized frame. Because steel was scarce in post-war Britain, these boxed frames are actually fairly thin gauge steel. So with a boxed frame, once salt and dirt and mud gets inside, there's really no way to stop rust from taking hold. You can't paint every surface of the inside of a boxed frame, so it's just a very susceptible design to rusting out. And also, because the suspension was so stiff on these vehicles and the frame was a pretty rigid design, you actually find stress cracks even on rust-free frames, and the steel on these boxed frames actually work hardens and then cracks. So even on a truck with what looks like a nice rust-free frame, we're still going to opt to put a new galvanized frame under that truck. And we certainly don't want to go through all this work if we can't guarantee that our frame is going to last at least the next 30 years. So beyond just the galvanizing, we also utilize stainless steel. So these vehicles have stainless steel gas tanks. So you can see that gas tank will never rust out. It also has a stainless steel exhaust system and stainless fasteners throughout. So the last point I want to touch on is the interior. So like the exterior, we want to keep all of the original NADA features in the interior, and we want to keep it looking as original as possible. So you can see we've restored the original steering wheel. This has about 10 hours of labor minimum to repair all the cracks in the bakelite and then sand it out and repaint it to this look. This is the proper sheen for the steering wheel. We even have the original type wrinkle paint on the horn button. We have the gauge cluster painted in the gloss black, just like the original 2As. One exception is the turn signal switch. We have this modern computerized turn signal switch, which works a lot smoother than the original turn signal switch, which cancels mechanically with a wheel that rides on the steering wheel. We also have deviated from original with the seats. So this is the correct type of seat for the 2A. These are called deluxe seats, and they have more bolstering than the earlier 2A seats. So these seats, instead of being a hot, sticky black vinyl, are actually this beautiful tweed from the Outer Hebrides and a chestnut leather. These are cool in the summer and warm in the winter. They feel great to the touch, and you can see throughout the bench seats in the back have the same upholstery. The brown chestnut leather and the tweed just seems to complement the pastel green body. You can also see the 5-speed shifter doesn't look that much different than an original double bent shifter that this truck would have had originally. The exception is it has a boot down here. The original shifter would have simply had a rubber grommet around the bottom, and the ball pivot for the shifter would have been exposed, and that pivot needs to be greased. So that means that you would have a greased moving pivot in your interior. With the 5-speed, you have this boot covering the Defender shift mechanism, and then you have a mushroom type shift knob with the 5-speed pattern engraved in it. So as close to original as possible, and all of the 4-wheel drive levers are retained. So we make special adapters when we install the transfer case 4 inches back. It allows us to retain the original shifters for the 4-wheel drive without having to do any complex linkage or move them back 4 inches, which just wouldn't look right. So I feel like that's a good bit of information on this 1971 Series 2A that we just completed the restoration in July of 2025. If you're interested in learning more, you can go to the website at NorthAmericaOverland.com. check out the inventory page, and there you could find the full spec sheet on the vehicle with every single modification and everything that we've done to this vehicle to bring it up to our NAO version 4 specs. If you're interested in having a conversation about the vehicle, you can send us an email at northamericauoverland@gmail.com. From there, we can arrange a phone call, and I would love to talk in greater depth about the restoration of this vehicle. The vehicle is available now. I have a little bit more test driving to do to get it to the 500-mile mark so we can change out the high zinc break-in oil and put regular oil in it. But from that point, the vehicle is ready for the next owner. So if you've always wanted a late Series 2A like this one is literally ready for you to get behind the wheel and start driving it.